Good morning, Your Excellency, and thank you for making the time to speak to me today. Um, it's a very hot day in August in Rome, and it was a great pleasure again meeting you in Delhi.
Well, it's good to be with you, and I've been in Rome on a few hot days, so I know I know what that's like. It's not it's quite pleasant down here in Australia. It's only about 10 to 14 in our winter, but that's about as cold as it gets in Sydney.
Oh, that's really nice. After the weather, coming to the first question, which is obviously the tensions that are happening in the Middle East and how you see it from Australia, and how you see the effects on the Indo-Pacific, specifically of this new Mecca Pact. What are your views on it? Do you see any effects, immediate effects on the Indo-Pacific? Do you see any further effects on China, India, Australia? What are your thoughts?
Well, the conflict itself, I think the Indo-Pacific has been the most impacted, apart from obviously the Middle East itself. Um, in terms of how the impact on the oil price, petroleum price, diesel, etc., and the many other products that come. That impact in the Indo-Pacific has been quite severe, and particularly for the more of the emerging economies, developing economies in the region, they have really felt the effects, I think, more than most. In the United States, they're somewhat more insulated from that as an oil producer. Australia, I think, has managed relatively well. I think they've been able to secure supplies. Prices are going up again now as the conflict and starts to heat up again, and the prospect of a resolution seems quite remote. Um, but one of the points I'd make is that, yes, the economic impacts of this conflict are real and they are causing some headline price inflation. A some sort of settlement of those issues, a reopening of the strait, and whatever those terms might be, can see that mitigated. But I think there are stronger drivers on inflation and what's causing the long duration price on bonds, particularly 30 years, things like that, which we've seen in the US and Japan in particular. It's risen to an unprecedented high. The cost of long end capital is only going up. And that's been driven by structural factors that go well beyond this conflict. And they go to demographics, they go through to the AI build out and the moving of that from one side of the balance sheet to the other. You've got central banks that aren't out there buying bonds; they're selling them. And so and then you've got the many other factors that play into this, currency and so on. So look, I think the long end price on money is one that I think is really going to condition a lot of what we're going to see economically in the years ahead. As for what we've seen happen with the pact, look, I think we're going to see more and more of this globally. I think what is happening with the global order is that it's becoming more distributed. Some call this the collapse of the order, but that's frankly those who used to run it. And they're getting used to not running it quite the same way they used to, and that includes out of Europe, frankly. Um, and so they will bemoan that, but in the Indo-Pacific, many countries in the Indo-Pacific have been a bit left out of that order for some time, and India in particular, and they will, are taking on, I think, a much more important role within geopolitics and certainly within the Indo-Pacific. So we will see more of these mini-lateral type deals, whether they be on security, on trade, on intelligence, and other issues, whether they be the environment or we're going to see more and more pluralism, I think, in the global order, and that is something we shouldn't see as a bad thing or necessarily as a good thing. It's just what it is. But I particularly with the emergence of developing economies and them playing a much bigger role by sheer size in the global economy, that it's going to have an obvious impact. It's going to impact on the performance of developed economies out of Europe. I mean, they're experiencing that firsthand, particularly with their auto sector and what they're seeing out of China. For many years, I think European economies looked at China with wide eyes in terms of what it meant for them. Well, they're seeing the other side of that picture now, and it may be not the opportunity that they first thought, and as a result, they're taking a defensive position. Australia saw, the rise of China and these things through a very different lens, and that was one impacting on regional security and impacting on, the regional order. And we took a very strong position on that, and that has been shared by our partners in Japan. And while independence remains the Indian policy, and it does, there has been a lean into, I think, that those security pressures in the Indo-Pacific from India, which provides a conditioning element, which I think is a good thing. If you can hold the system in some form of détente at worst and partnership at best, well, that can only be a good thing.
Let me come to China because specifically because during your term you had a very firm stand against China, if I can put it mildly. Um, do you see China's role increasing indirectly in these minilaterals like the Mecca Pact, given their outreach to the Organization of Islamic Countries, the
Mm.
Palestinian groups over time? Do you see China being an encouraging factor?
They're not always in them. And I don't think they always will. In many cases, they won't be, specifically. The minilateral process enables like-minded countries to band together to deal with particular problems or issues. And sometimes that is the hegemonic threat of a country like the PRC or Russia or Iran or whoever that might be, North Korea. Um, so no, I don't think, I mean, I think they will try and be them in them all. That's certainly their approach, but that doesn't mean they will be. But where their interests align with the other parties, then I would expect to see that happen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that will, um, you know, tip the balance when it comes to influence. There will be a plurality of these things. And countries like Australia, for example, have to be proactive about that. But I think we will be. I think this has always been our approach. I mean, our embrace of ASEAN, for example, ever since its inception, we have an outstanding relationship with ASEAN, and governments of both political persuasions have pursued that consistently. The Quad is a minilateral, and I think a potentially very powerful one, if it sticks to its focus and has a strong agenda which embraces both security and economics as well as humanitarian issues. So yeah, they'll be in some, they won't be in others, but Australia will be in some and not others. So will the US, so will Japan, so will Korea, so will India, and we'll see more and more of this.
Coming to the Quad, during your term, you took Quad to a leader level summit, and that's in some way, with the current US administration, got diluted. Also, with the Mecca Pact, you see that the India, UAE, Israel, what would be the I2U2 minilateral, is strengthening itself because it's forced to because of obvious regional changes. Do you see now, with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Australia, the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Australia, the Quad, without US engagement, strengthening itself and becoming more of a military minilateral, or do you see it remaining economic and less military?
Well, firstly, I think the US is far more engaged than the question suggests. Um, I think they are engaged, and I think particularly the Secretary of State Rubio uh, and his Deputy Secretary, for that matter, who I was only with a few months ago, a month or so ago in Washington. I think they're very aware of the significant role of the Quad, and they've taken a strong view about it when it comes to issues of maritime security. Um, and not just in the Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I'm a keen advocate for more Indo in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to the agenda of the Quad. They've also been critically focused on critical minerals and rare earths, and that is something that I think the Quad is well placed to address with the assets and economic levers that each of those parties hold. And they are pursuing those. They're pursuing them bilaterally as well as doing it together. The security element of the Quad was reinforced by Secretary Rubio literally the day after the administration was sworn in. with the meeting of the foreign ministers. I think the foreign ministers have been making some good progress. It's obviously disappointing the leaders haven't done that yet, but seeing both the Japanese and Indian prime ministers in Australia is a welcome thing, a very welcome thing. And I had the opportunity to see Prime Minister Modi when he was here as well, and appreciated that opportunity. And we had quite a long conversation about things in the Indo-Pacific. And he remains very alive to those issues. And I think India's engagement in the Quad is what makes it so unique. I can't underscore that enough. And India's continued engagement with the Quad is critical to its success.
Where would you see India's foreign policy take it in the next 10 years? We're now on the eve of the 80th Independence Day of the country.
Yeah.
We have a brilliant, stable government in India and a very dynamic leader who you've had lots of opportunity to interact with. Where would you see India's future in the next 10 years take it in the region and in the world?
India is quite unapologetic about realizing its potential and being national interest driven. I think India continues to honor its independence, its independent settings, but not slavishly, not for its own sake. I think its interests drive it into closer engagement with the United States, Australia, Japan, and Korea, and many other countries. But then that is not done to the exclusion of its other relationships that it continues to have. And I've found Prime Minister Modi, not in any negative sense, but quite unapologetic about the fact that he'll pick up the phone and he'll talk to whoever he wants to. He'll go to whichever country he needs to advance India's national interest. And that is not a unique position. I mean, that's what every leader of every country does, is advance their national interests. So I think Prime Minister Modi has brought a very strong national interest focus and a very practical focus to India's foreign policy. And Dr. Jaishankar has been an able lieutenant in that process as well, and incredibly industrious in following through on that leadership. And I think you've got to really commend the role he's played in all of that. So whether it's on the economy, whether it's on technology, whether it's on space, I mean, the Prime Minister Modi he's very committed to India realizing its space capabilities, and India is a country that is well placed geographically, but also industrially, I think, to realize that potential. I think India will be a space powerhouse over the next 20, 30 years as its space economy matures, because you can do equatorial launch there, you can do polar, polar pole to pole launches. You can do all of this. Plus, you've got an expanding industrial base in your space economy. I only make reference to that because it's an example, I think, of embracing a lot of new opportunities that are well tied to India's future. It's not just going to be, doing the sort of superficial, synthetic repeat of other developed economies. I think India's plan is to go far deeper in that, whether it's in tech or building out its capital base as well and drawing further investment capital into India. So there's a lot more maturing to do in the Indian economy. That's not a criticism. That's just it's more of an optimistic statement about the opportunities that are ahead. Now, there are big challenges as well. It still remains a difficult place to do business. There's a lot of regulatory reform that is required to have greater certainty, but it is anchored in the same way Australia is, and in a rule of law and a system of government, which provides a lot of stability that many other developing economies haven't been able to rely on to the same extent. I mean, India takes its democracy, its institutions seriously, and must, because it's a big part of your investment pitch as to why people would risk capital in India. We've seen capital retired out of China. Where will it go? India will be one of those countries making that pitch, and I think it can make a good one. So, what is the purpose of India's foreign policy? Not looking to run the world, not necessarily even looking to change it, I don't think, but ensuring that India can play its role and realise its own potential in whatever that world becomes. I'm sure India would like to influence that direction, but one that will be convenient to its own national interests, and that is no different to any other government on the planet.
Coming back to Australia, from the Indian end, from the European end, we tend to see the Indo-Pacific, let's call it a little more nearsightedly, because our vision extends to Malacca and the South China Sea.
Mm.
How do you see the Indo-Pacific shaping up from Australia? How do you see the challenges? And do you see China as the main challenge, or do you see other challenges cropping up in the near future?
Well, what I see and what our government sees may be two different things.
I'm
Um,
asking for your perspective.
yeah, I think Australia is uniquely positioned to have, I think, the most all-encompassing view about the Indo-Pacific. We have the longest stretch of coastline on the Indian Ocean of any country in the world. But equally so, we have a similar coastline that borders the Pacific. Um, and our economic future lies in both oceans. And there are real security issues in both of those oceans. Obviously, in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, or for that matter, the East China Sea, there are the obvious tensions in those parts of the world, which we take a keen interest in, and they were critical factors in the decisions we took from a defence point of view and the assets we needed, particularly in terms of submarines and things of that nature, and the defence technology that we're developing under AUKUS and with other additions to that. But you can't look across on the Indian Ocean when you look at it as its trade routes, at its submarine cables, at so much of the traffic, data, fuel, logistics, containers, you name it, that goes across that stretch ocean, which connects Europe, the Middle East to Asia, um, and between two of the biggest choke points in the world, the Malacca Strait and right now the Strait of Hormuz. Well, you've got to look at that and understand that this is a waterway and this is a region that if it has not quite reached if you like, the warm levels of what's happening in the Pacific, I caution to call them hot. It certainly has that potential, and I would want to see Australia taking a far more proactive view about security issues in the Indo-Pacific, about economic issues in the Indo-Pacific, and not allow the Pacific agenda overwhelm. I think that theatre, because if it is not paid attention to early, then it will have to be late. And because we've already seen China seek to extend its influence in the Indian Ocean theatre. We've seen that everywhere from Sri Lanka. Of course, we've seen it in Pakistan. You're seeing it in Myanmar. Now, I think, to be fair, a lot of that at the moment is very economically focused. Um, but our experience in the South China Sea tells us that's where it starts. It's not where it ends. Um, and I think India is a very awake to that threat, very awake to that threat. I think India is also very awake to the economic threat as well. I mean, if you look at the trade balance between China and India, it's one-way traffic, totally one-way traffic, and that is not in India's interests. And in many ways, India has a bigger beef with China on trade than the Americans do.
Coming to AUKUS, you were key behind the establishment of AUKUS. Um, would you foresee also, first of all, what do you see the future of AUKUS? Do you see it increasing the number of participants? There was French for a bit. Do you see India getting involved at some point? What would be your vision for AUKUS?
AUKUS will remain as it is, a tripartite arrangement which is focused on to deliver under Pillar 1 of the submarine capability, which is not just about Australia acquiring submarines, but being able to build them as well and adding to the overall trilateral submarine fleet of those three nations. It also directly involves, in the first instance, of US submarine forces rotating through Western Australia, which puts a greater US presence in that part of the world, which is on the Indian Ocean. So it's not a Pacific based. It's an Indian Ocean based presence called Surf West. And of course, the second pillar is all about the development of defence technology. Now, it's in that area where I think there will be opportunities for project by project partnerships with, say, Japan. I would say most likely. Korea possibly. Whether there's the budget for countries, allied countries like the Philippines or the United States to participate in that, I think is a different type of question. But yes, on the development technology, yes, and could that happen with India? Possibly, but I don't think India's asking, nor is the US offering. So, but I don't think that's a tension. I just think it's where things are at. But it will and has already provided a pretty big rock in the jar in I think providing enough tension in the Chord strategically in the region to provide a deterrent, and will continue to do that. And that is fundamentally its task. It is to provide that balancing deterrent in the Indo-Pacific to ensure that you can have a stability which enables for prosperity and for peace within the region. Well, peace is probably too strong a word. The absence of conflict, and for countries to be able to, get on with their business without, being intimidated or in any way bullied.
I'll move geographies for our last question, given that I'm in Rome and we're in Italy, and also given that we were speaking about defense technology. How do you
Mm.
see Australia and Italy cooperation shape up? What are your views on Prime Minister Meloni? What are your views on defense technology cooperation with Italy?
Well, it already exists, which is a good thing. I think, companies like Leonardo, they're a serious prime, a very, very serious prime player, as you know only too well. And Leonardo are already active in Australia in terms of the helicopters and things of that nature. But as Europe and most Western democracies are now rearming, that is going to draw heavily on the industrial base of the Western world. And so to think that any one country is going to be able to respond to that and meet that demand, I think is foolish. And so I think the private industrial base is what Western democracies have as its advantage. And that ecosystem, that networking, that partnership, that interoperability, the ability to work with others in the private sector from different countries that are part of that sort of Western democracy defense industrial base is going to be really important into the future. And so I think Australia is a great meeting ground for all of that. I really do. Um, in the US, it's obviously going to continue to be heavily dominated by US primes. But increasingly, in the Indo-Pacific, think you're going to see a lot more mix and match. Australia already draws heavily on European defence, the European defence industrial base. Sure, we mightn't have gone ahead with the naval submarines, but that didn't mean we were still proceeding with. At the time, I think it was well over 25 billion worth of procurements out of European defence companies. Um, and the quality is outstanding. So we're going to need it all. You're going to need it all. You're going to need us. We're going to need you. India's going to need everybody. But India will also be over time building its own defence industrial base capability, and it'll draw on the technology and the people of those more advanced countries, who will, I think, potentially see a good operating base for themselves in India, and that will be supported by a growing Indian defence budget. So that'll give them a good reason to be there. Um, unless your defence department is buying, well, it's very hard for an indigenous defence industrial base to become established and grow. Uh, it's not going to grow without contracts. And then, those contracts have got to be moving at a different pace to what we saw during, the prolonged periods of peacetime, especially post the Cold War. I mean, we've built procurement systems around elaborate systems that, where time didn't cost anything, particularly from a strategic point of view. It does cost something now. So having something now, as Ukraine has demonstrated and Iran has demonstrated, having something now is worth a lot compared to maybe having something 5 years from now. It could be the most sophisticated, beautiful piece of equipment you can manage, but pretty useless if it's not on the battlefield tomorrow afternoon. So getting a balance between those things will be important. And you only got to look at the performance, I think, of those defence companies to see on their own markets. the increasing interest that is coming from investors because they can see the enduring demand which will be there to support their investments.
Last messages to Europeans on Australia and the Indo-Pacific before we sign off.
Be engaged. I mean, the Indo-Pacific is now the geopolitical center of the world. And I think that is a hard thing for Europe to come to terms with. And I think there's a resistance to coming to that conclusion. Europe is still strong. It is still a massive economy. It's a sophisticated economy. But understanding what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, the security and economic challenges and threats that that presents, as well as the opportunity, I think is critical for European companies. Absolutely critical. And so it's an area of expertise they need to build. And I would encourage them to do that. I think Australia and India are great platforms, places for Europe to, get that understanding of this part of the world. India and Australia are very different countries, but whether it's the two I've mentioned, or in Japan and Korea, or to the extent they can engage with other countries in the region, I would with the Pacific. I mean, the French have over a long period of time have good relationships with many countries, island countries in the Pacific. You know, continuing to reach out and providing that sort of a participation with economies of the Indo-Pacific, I think is really important. Whereas I think in the past it was seen as over there. They're over there now. Europe's over there. This is the center of the world.
Thank you so much, Excellency, for making the time. I hope we can host you in Rome at some point in the near future. And if not, I hope to run into you in India again. So thank
I
you
sure
again,
will.
and hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks very much. Great to talk
Have
to
a
you.
great evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.